The afternoon sun filtered through the tall windows of Le Grand Maison, scattering golden reflections across the polished marble floors. Every corner of the restaurant whispered luxury, crystal chandeliers dangling like frozen stars, velvet curtains cascading in heavy folds, and tables set with silverware so polished they looked untouched by human hands. And weaving silently through all that extravagance was Pedro. He moved with smooth, practiced steps, balancing trays with the elegance of a dancer. But beneath his calm expression, there was always a quiet tension, a feeling of walking across a stage where he didn't belong. Pedro had grown up far from places like this. His childhood smelled of rain-soaked earth, street food, and the detergent his mother used after long nights washing clothes for wealthier families. He remembered telling her once, as a child, that he dreamed of working in a beautiful place someday. She had smiled, tired but proud. "You will, meu filho. And when you do, remember that your worth doesn't come from where you work, but from who you are." Those words echoed every time Pedro tied the apron around his waist. But working at Le Grand Maison was a different world, one where looks whispered louder than hearts. The wealthy customers didn't see him as a person. They saw only a uniform, a shadow that refilled glasses and apologized for things that weren't his fault. Still, Pedro tried to carry dignity in every step. He needed the job. He needed the money. And more than anything, he needed to believe that his dreams still mattered. A quiet storm. On that particular afternoon, the restaurant buzzed with energy. A high society event had been booked, the kind that filled the place with pearls, diamonds, and people who loved being seen. Pedro had already memorized the details. Table 1 wanted their wine chilled exactly 10 minutes. Table 4 had a guest allergic to rosemary. Table 7 demanded their silverware be replaced after every bite. Yes, every bite. He moved from table to table with precision, but inside, a familiar pressure tightened his chest. He knew Gisele Moreau, the owner, would arrive soon. Everyone knew the signs, the sudden silence among the staff, the shift in lighting, the way even the manager stood straighter as if his spine might snap. Gisele liked power the way some people like perfume. She wore it, bathed in it, and made sure everyone smelled it on her. Pedro always tried to stay out of her path, but fate, as always, had other plans. A moment of humanity. As he bent down to pick up a napkin a child dropped, Pedro felt a small tug on his sleeve. He looked up to see the little girl staring at him with innocent curiosity. "Why is everyone so serious here?" she asked softly. Pedro smiled, genuine warmth in his eyes. "Because grown-ups forget how to breathe when they think they're important." The girl giggled, a sound so honest it felt out of place among all the diamond-draped conversations. For a brief moment, Pedro felt human again, seen, not just another body passing by. But the moment vanished when he stood and noticed the head waiter glaring at him. Less chatting, more serving. The man hissed. Pedro swallowed the sting. "Yes, sir." An unavoidable crossing. He turned toward the kitchen, and that's when he heard it. The sharp, unmistakable click of high heels. Gisele had arrived. The staff stiffened instantly. Even the air seemed to pause. Pedro kept his eyes forward, but he felt her presence like cold wind brushing the back of his neck. She entered the room with the confidence of someone who believed the world belonged to her, and perhaps in her mind, it did. Her diamond earrings glittered like tiny suns, and her expression was carved from ice. One look at her employees was enough to make several of them tremble. Pedro inhaled quietly. "Just stay invisible," he told himself. "Just get through the shift." But just as he took one step to retreat into the kitchen, "You!" Gisele snapped. Her voice sliced through the dining room. Pedro stopped. A knot tightened in his stomach. Slowly, he turned around. And in that single moment, he already knew. Nothing about this day would end the way he hoped. The room fell into a cold hush the moment Gisele Moreau called Pedro. She didn't need to shout. Her voice carried a sharpness that could slice through velvet. Pedro turned slowly, trying to mask the tightening fear in his chest. Gisele stood at the center of the dining room, a woman dressed in power. Her black dress shimmered like oil under the chandelier light, and her diamond necklace rested against her skin like a symbol of superiority. Her hair was perfectly styled, unmoving, untouched by the chaos she brought everywhere. People admired her fortune. What they didn't see was the cruelty that lived behind her flawless lipstick. She took one step toward Pedro, then another. Each step echoed through the marble floors like the beat of an approaching storm. The inspection. "Come here," she ordered, as though calling a stray dog. Pedro obeyed. Every eye in the restaurant drifted toward them. The wealthy guests sipped wine and watched, pretending not to care, but hungry for drama. When Pedro reached her, Gisele's gaze traveled from his worn shoes to the slight wrinkle on his apron. Her lips curled. "What is this?" she demanded. Pedro glanced down, confused. "Madam, is there something wrong?" "Everything is wrong," she snapped. "You can't even dress like a proper employee. Do you expect me to let you walk around serving my guests looking like this?" He swallowed hard. "My uniform is clean, madam. I apologize if—" Always with excuses." She waved her hand dismissively. Typical. The word typical hit Pedro like a hidden insult, the kind meant to remind him of exactly where she believed he belonged. Cracks in the mask, the restaurant manager approached timidly. "Madame Gisele, perhaps—" She raised a single finger, silencing him without a word. That finger was her scepter, and she wielded it like a queen depriving someone of mercy. Her attention snapped back to Pedro. "You think you can work here simply because you know how to carry a tray? This restaurant is a sanctuary of excellence." Pedro nodded, keeping his voice steady. "Yes, madam, I do my best." "Your best?" she repeated with a laugh that carried no warmth. "If this is your best, then it's pathetic." Her voice rose, echoing through the room. Guests paused mid-conversation. Wine glasses hovered mid-air. A pianist in the corner stopped playing. The silence grew heavy, suffocating. Pedro felt small, not because of who he was, but because of the stage she forced him onto. A moment of defiance. For a brief second, Pedro's eyes lifted to hers. Not with anger, not with challenge, just with quiet pain. Gisele noticed, and it enraged her. "How dare you look at me like that?" she barked. Pedro blinked, unsure what she meant. "Madam, I'm only trying to understand." "Understand?" She stepped closer, her breath cold on his face. "You are here to obey, not to understand." Her words slammed into him like stones. The guests whisper. A couple seated nearby leaned toward each other. "He didn't do anything wrong," the woman whispered. "Hush," her husband murmured. "Don't get involved. She's dangerous." Another guest whispered, "She's always hated him. Probably because she can't stand anyone who isn't like her." Rumors traveled fast, but help traveled nowhere. Gisele was feared, and the entire staff tiptoed around her like nervous shadows. The brewing storm. Gisele circled Pedro slowly, like a predator evaluating prey. "When I hired you," she said, "I thought perhaps you could bring a certain exotic charm to my restaurant. But you're nothing but a disappointment." Her voice dripped venom. Pedro clenched his fists behind his back to stop them from shaking. "Madam," he said quietly, "I work hard. I truly do." She smirked. "I'm sure you think you do." Then she turned to the watching room, her voice rising theatrically. "Look at him. Look at this disaster of an employee. This is why I have to supervise everything myself." Pedro felt heat spreading across his face. Embarrassment, shame, disbelief. He wanted to disappear, to melt into the marble floor, to escape the eyes burning into him. But he stood still, because leaving would mean accepting defeat, and he wasn't ready for that. Not yet. The moment before impact. Gisele stopped in front of him again, her eyes narrowed like a hawk preparing to strike. A dangerous silence settled over the room. Pedro didn't know it then, but what happened next would become the moment that changed the rest of his life. The final straw, the breaking point, the humiliation that would plant the first seed of his future victory. He had no way to defend himself, no way to run, and Gisele had no intention of stopping. The restaurant was silent, silent in that suffocating way where everyone hears everything, the clinking of a glass, the trembling of breath, the unspoken thrill of watching someone else be destroyed. Pedro stood frozen, his hands behind his back, trying desperately not to show fear. Gisele stood inches from him, her perfume thick and sharp in the air. She loved this, the attention, the power, the spectacle. And Pedro could feel it, the cruel anticipation building inside her like a storm ready to break. The accusation. "You think you belong here," she whispered, loud enough for everyone to hear. Her voice dripped with disgust. Pedro tried to respond gently. "Madam, I only wish to serve well. If I made a mistake, I—" "A mistake?" Her voice exploded. "You are the mistake." A murmur rippled through the guests. Pedro felt a sting inside his chest, but he kept his head lowered. Respectful, patient, trying to survive the moment. But Gisele wasn't finished. She stepped closer, her heels clicking sharply. Her eyes shone with the thrill of destroying someone who couldn't fight back. "You are nothing more than a starving wretch pretending to be useful." Pedro exhaled shakily. He had heard insults before, but something in her tone, something in the way she looked at him, felt personal, dangerously personal, the spit. And then, without warning, she leaned in and spat in his face. The sound echoed, a wet, ugly splatter. Time stopped. Guests gasped. A fork slipped from someone's fingers. The pianist froze mid-note. Pedro felt the warm spit sliding down his cheek, burning like acid. His vision blurred, not from tears but from the shock. Something inside him collapsed, something fragile, something he hadn't realized he still had. Dignity. He felt it crack. The slap. He lifted a hand to wipe his cheek, trembling. But before he could touch his face, Gisele slapped him, hard and sharp, with the full force of years of entitlement. Crack. The sound echoed across the restaurant like a whip. Pedro staggered backward. His cheek burned. His ears rang. He tasted blood. Every eye in the restaurant stared at him. Some horrified, some entertained, some indifferent. Not a single one dared to intervene. He stood there, chest rising and falling, heart shaking inside his ribs. The breaking point. Gisele tilted her chin smugly. "That's what you deserve," she said coldly. "You dirtied my restaurant the minute you walked in. You don't belong here. People like you never do." Each word stabbed deeper. Pedro felt his throat tighten. He wanted to shout, to defend himself, to say he worked harder than anyone here, that he had dreams, dignity, value, but the words wouldn't come. He felt too small, too crushed. The final blow. "You're fired," Gisele said. Her voice was almost bored now, as though dismissing a mosquito. "No explanation, no salary, no rights. I want you out of my sight before you embarrass me further." Pedro swallowed hard. His lips trembled. His eyes burned. But he refused, absolutely refused, to let tears fall while she watched. So he bowed his head, his voice barely a whisper. "Yes, madam." Then he turned around and walked away slowly, holding what little remained of his pride together, piece by shaking piece. Behind him, laughter rose, not from joy, but from the cruel delight of gossip. A woman whispered, "He must be used to being treated like that." A man chuckled. "At least now she'll hire someone more presentable." Pedro didn't look back. Not once. The promise outside. He finally let the tears fall, silent, hot, unstoppable. He pressed his hand to his cheek, feeling the sting of the slap and the colder sting of humiliation. He stared up at the restaurant's golden letters, glowing under the streetlights. La Grande Maison. He knew he didn't belong there. Not yet. But one day, these same lights would shine for him. He whispered through clenched teeth, "I will rise. And when I return, she will remember my name." And with that vow burning in his chest, Pedro walked into the night, broken, ashamed, humiliated, but no longer powerless, because humiliation had just awakened his destiny. Rain had begun to fall by the time Pedro reached the bus stop. Thin, cold drops that soaked through his uniform and mixed with the remnants of Gisele's spit still lingering on his skin. But Pedro didn't raise a hand to wipe his face. He just stood there, motionless, shaking, breathing through the ache in his chest. The rain washed away the humiliation he couldn't wash away himself. For a long moment he felt truly lost, like a man without a place in the world. But beneath the grief, beneath the shame, something faint stirred. A spark, a seed, a decision. He wasn't going to let the world tell him who he was. Not anymore. A new beginning. The next weeks were a blur of disappointment. Pedro applied for jobs everywhere. Cafes, bakeries, hotels, catering services. But Gisele's influence was bigger than he ever realized. Word had spread. He was difficult, disrespectful, unreliable. Every manager denied him politely, but the truth sat behind their eyes. They were afraid of angering Gisele Moreau. Pedro felt doors closing one after another, but he kept walking. He took temporary night shifts at a small motel, washed dishes at a dirty street restaurant, delivered groceries on foot. Some days he ate, some days he didn't, but he worked every single day because he refused to break. Studying in the shadows. At night, when his body screamed for rest, Pedro forced himself to open an old used notebook and study. Business management, basic accounting, kitchen organization, customer service psychology, gastronomy fundamentals. He bought books from thrift stores with coins he could barely spare. He watched free online lessons in internet cafes. He wrote notes by candlelight when the electricity in his small apartment was cut. He wasn't studying because he believed he could rise. He was studying because he had to rise. Every humiliation he endured became fuel. Every insult became motivation. Every slap, every spit became a voice pushing him forward. You will return, Pedro, but not as a waiter. Kindness returns. One afternoon, while working as a dishwasher in a hotel kitchen, Pedro noticed a chef struggling to carry a large crate of produce. The chef was older, frail, and visibly tired. Pedro rushed to help. Let me get that for you, he said, lifting the crate effortlessly. The chef smiled wide. Thank you, son. Most people pretend not to see me. Pedro shrugged gently. I know what that feels like. From that day forward, the chef, Seu Matias, took a liking to Pedro. He taught him recipes during breaks, explained how restaurants worked behind the scenes. And one night, while they sat on crates by the back door eating leftover soup, Pedro opened up about his past. Seu Matias listened silently, then placed a hand on Pedro's shoulder. Some people are placed in our lives to break us, he said, but others are placed to help us rebuild. You're not meant to stay where you fell. Those words struck something deep. For the first time in months, Pedro felt hope again. An unexpected door. Months later, Seu Matias introduced Pedro to a group of investors who visited the hotel kitchen during a private event. These men invest in food startups, Matias whispered, but they care about character more than money. Try talking to them. Pedro hesitated. His heart thudded. He had no fancy clothes, no degree, no resume worth showing. But he had something the wealthy rarely possessed: humility and heart. He spoke to them honestly, about his dreams, his vision, and his belief that a restaurant should treat every person with dignity, regardless of their bank account or appearance. The investors exchanged glances. One of them leaned forward. You speak about hospitality with passion. That's rare. Another smiled. Would you show us your concept? If we like it, we might help. Pedro's breath caught. That night, he stayed awake until dawn, drawing sketches, writing ideas, listing dishes, calculating costs. He poured his whole soul into that proposal. It wasn't polished, it wasn't perfect, but it was authentic. And when he presented it, they didn't see a former waiter. They saw a leader, a creator, a man who had survived humiliation without losing his humanity. They shook his hand. We believe in you, Pedro. Let's build this together. the first stone of his empire. 3 months later, Pedro opened his very first restaurant, Casa Aurora, the House of Dawn, a symbol of new beginnings. It was small, humble, nothing like La Grande Maison. But people felt something special the moment they walked in. Warmth, respect, heart. Pedro greeted every customer personally. He knew regulars by name. He served water with a smile, the same smile no one had ever given him when he was a waiter. And people felt that. They returned, then brought friends, then posted online. Weeks later, lines stretched outside the door. Casa Aurora became a phenomenon. And as Pedro stood in the kitchen one night, looking at the full tables, the laughter, the joy, he remembered Gisele's slap. Her spit, her words, "You are nothing but a starving wretch." He exhaled slowly. "No," he whispered to himself. "I was never the wretch. I was the seed." And now, he was growing. Casa Aurora became more than a restaurant. It became a refuge. A place where people felt welcomed, not judged. A place where kindness flavored every dish. A place that reflected the soul of the man who had built it from nothing. The walls were simple. The tables modest. But the warmth could be tasted in every bite. Pedro worked from dawn to midnight every day, cooking, cleaning, greeting guests, helping staff, hugging regulars, whispering encouragement to new employees during their first day. He was the owner, yes, but never above anyone. He was still the boy who knew how it felt to be invisible. Word spreads. One morning, as Pedro was slicing fresh herbs, Sir Matias approached him with a newspaper in hand. "Look," he said, tapping the front page. A food critic had written, "Casa Aurora reminds us what restaurants were meant to be, not silent temples of arrogance, but homes filled with humanity." Pedro stared at the print, speechless. For the first time in years, someone saw him, not as a servant, not as a mistake, not as a target, but as a creator. He felt a sting of tears. "Você merece, meu filho," Matias whispered. Growth begins. Within a year, Pedro opened a second restaurant, then a third, then a fourth. Different names, different menus, but all carrying the same heartbeat: respect. Investors approached him now, not the other way around. He appeared in magazines, on food blogs, on talk shows, but fame didn't change him. Every morning he still visited each restaurant personally, greeting the cooks, cleaning counters, laughing with customers, helping carry ingredients. His success was built on the foundation of every humiliation he had survived, and he never forgot it. The first whisper of her name. One evening, as Pedro left his fourth restaurant, a young waiter approached him shyly. "Sir, I don't know if you already heard, but, La Grande Maison." Pedro stopped walking. His breath caught. The waiter continued, "It's failing. People say the owner treats staff like trash. Customers are complaining. A big scandal happened last week." Pedro nodded slowly. His heart didn't race, but something old, a buried sting, awoke inside him. He stayed quiet for a moment. Then he simply said, "Thank you." But when he got home, he sat in silence for a long time, staring at the floor. La Grande Maison, the place where he had been spat on, slapped, humiliated in front of strangers. The place that had told him he would never be worth anything, was now collapsing, not because of him, but because of its own cruelty. He closed his eyes. Life had a strange way of balancing the scales. Rumors becoming reality. The whispers grew. Customers who once worshipped Gisele's restaurant began flocking to Pedro's establishments instead. Reviewers wrote, "La Grande Maison has lost its charm. The food is mediocre, but the arrogance is unchanged. The owner belittles staff and treats guests with disdain." One waiter confessed to Pedro, "She fired 3 people in a week. She screamed at a customer. They say she threw a plate at a cook." Pedro listened, but didn't react. Others waited for him to celebrate, to laugh, to enjoy her downfall. But Pedro never did. He remembered standing in front of her, tears burning behind his eyes, trying to hold himself together. He remembered the sting of her palm, the sound of laughter behind his back, the weight of humiliation crushing him on the walk home. He had promised to return, yes, but he hadn't promised revenge. He had promised growth. He had promised dignity. He had promised to rise. A call from a stranger. One afternoon, Pedro received a call from a real estate broker. "Mr. Pedro, I'm contacting you because a very well-located property is being sold urgently. A restaurant, prestigious location, but the owner is drowning in debt." Pedro didn't speak at first. He already knew which restaurant it was. The broker hesitated. "The name is Le Grande Maison." The words hovered in the air like smoke. Pedro closed his eyes. The memory of his humiliation rose like an old ghost, but this time it didn't hurt. It only reminded him of how far he had come. He took a breath. "Schedule a visit," he said calmly. "I want to see it." The calm before the return. That night, Pedro stood outside one of his restaurants, watching the warm glow of lights through the windows. People inside smiled. They laughed. They clinked glasses. They embraced. They felt at home. He had built something beautiful. But now, it was time to confront the place that had once broken him. Not out of hatred, but out of justice, out of closure, out of destiny. With a quiet, steady voice, he whispered to himself, "Tomorrow, I go back." In the months that followed, something remarkable began to happen inside Solar Debano. New customers arrived every single day. Food bloggers praised the dishes, influencers posted videos tasting the menu, and for the first time in years, the restaurant was packed even on weekdays. But what touched Pedro the most wasn't the fame or the money. It was the smiles. The employees were proud. They walked lighter, spoke kinder, worked with joy. For the first time, everyone felt they belonged. Pedro often paused in the middle of the dining hall, simply observing. Sometimes he had to blink several times, as if trying to convince himself that everything happening around him wasn't just a dream. But while Pedro's success rose like the sun, Gisele's life was collapsing. The fall of Gisele. After losing the restaurant, everything in Gisele's world dissolved. She tried opening a new establishment, but no employees would stay. Years of arrogance and prejudice had left scars too deep. Word spread quickly. In online forums, customers wrote, "I'd never eat anywhere she manages." The same arrogance she once used as a weapon was now an anchor dragging her down. Her reputation shattered. Her savings dried up. Her wealthy friends, the ones who toasted with her at every party, vanished as soon as she lost influence. Gisele, the woman who once mocked Pedro's poverty, now stared at her own reflection and saw something unbearable. Pedro was not the miserable one. She was. An unexpected knock. One rainy morning, while Pedro was reviewing reservations in his office, someone knocked on the door. "Sir, someone is here asking for you," the receptionist whispered. "Send them in." The door opened. Pedro froze. Gisele. She looked nothing like the powerful woman he once knew. Hair messy, clothes worn, eyes tired, a shadow of her former self. She entered slowly, as if the air itself weighed heavily. "Pedro," she murmured, her voice cracking. "I need to talk to you." He didn't respond. He simply gestured toward the chair. Gisele sat down, inhaled deeply, and released the words she never thought she would say. I want to work here." Pedro blinked. For a moment he wondered if he had heard wrong. She continued, tears gathering in her eyes. "I lost everything. No one will hire me. The restaurant I tried to open went bankrupt. Investors ran away. I'm desperate." She lifted her trembling gaze. "Please, give me a chance." A silence that cut deeper than words. For several long seconds, Pedro said nothing. Inside him, two versions of himself stood face to face. The boy humiliated, slapped, spat on, called a starving wretch, and the man who rebuilt his life with dignity, discipline, and courage. He looked down at his hands, the same hands that once shook because of her, now steady, now strong. "Gisele," he began softly, "you're asking me for a job. Here, in this restaurant?" She nodded, ashamed. Pedro stood up, walked to the window and watched the rain fall outside. Then he turned back toward her, a calm, powerful expression on his face. "You will have a chance." Gisele gasped with relief, but Pedro continued. "Not as a manager, not as an owner, not as a superior." He stepped closer. "You will start exactly where you threw me away." Gisele froze. "As a waitress, simple uniform, full shifts, no privileges, no insults." He stared into her eyes. "And here, everyone is treated with respect. Understood?" The tears finally streamed down her cheeks. I accept." Pedro offered a small, steady nod. "Welcome to Solar Debano, Gisele. Here, those who learn to serve, learn to be human." The silence that followed wasn't cruelty, it was justice. Months passed, and Solar Debano became one of the most respected restaurants in the entire region. Not just for its food, though critics praised every dish, but for its story, a story whispered among customers. A place rebuilt by a man who once had nothing, and who chose justice over revenge. Gisele's transformation. Gisele remained as a waitress, quiet, punctual, and humbled. At first, customers who recognized her would whisper things like, "Isn't that the former owner? What happened to her?" She swallowed the shame every time, but instead of breaking, she learned. For the first time in her life, she understood what it meant to serve others, to carry trays, to bow her head, to earn her place, and little by little, something inside her shifted. She began apologizing to former employees. She stayed after hours to help clean without being asked. She learned to say please and thank you, words that once burned her tongue. And Pedro watched everything in silence, never humiliating her, never raising his voice. He didn't need to. Life had already taught her what he never could. Pedro's victory. One evening, when the restaurant had closed and the staff gathered for their end-of-day meeting, Pedro stood at the center of the hall. Everyone quieted instantly. "I want to say something," he began. His voice was steady, but emotion glimmered beneath. "Years ago, I was humiliated in this very place. I was told I was worthless. I was fired for something I could never change." Some employees lowered their heads, remembering stories they had heard. "But I didn't let hatred shape me, and you shouldn't either, because dignity is something no one can take away from you." Gisele stood at the back of the group, tears silently rolling down her face. Pedro turned to her, not with anger, but with a calm compassion she did not deserve but desperately needed. "Gisele, you are no longer the woman who spit on me. You've changed, and change is worth more than status." She sobbed, unable to speak. Pedro smiled softly. "Tomorrow you begin your new position." Everyone exchanged surprised looks. "You will no longer be a waitress," Pedro continued. "From tomorrow on, you'll train as a floor supervisor." Gisele covered her face, overwhelmed. "Not because of your past," he added, "but because of who you've proven you're becoming." The staff applauded, not out of fear, as in the old days, but out of respect. For Pedro, for redemption, for the victory of character over cruelty. Closing scene. That night, when Pedro locked the restaurant and stepped outside, the city lights reflected softly on the pavement. The cool breeze brushed his face, gentle, refreshing, like a long-awaited answer. He looked at the building behind him, the place where he had once been humiliated, and now owned. A small smile curved his lips. "Mine. You were right," he whispered into the night. "They didn't know who I would become." He walked away slowly, shoulders relaxed, heart full. For true victory was never about money. It was about becoming the man he once needed someone to believe he could be. And he had become infinitely more.